Last year, the Chancellor Rachel Reeves announced that winter fuel payments for pensioners would be means tested. She hoped that this brave and bold decision to stabilise Britain's finances would be welcomed as a sign Labour were a serious government full of serious people. Labour ministers even warned that without such difficult choices, the bond vigilantes were just waiting around the corner. It was a stunning political miscalculation, and despite accounting for less than 1% of all UK government spending, it gained a political significance beyond its actual impact. When YouGov asked voters the single worst thing the Labour government had done in their first 100 days in office, there was only one winner: winter fuel payments. 1 year of plunging polls and by-election defeats, and the government has announced a partial U-turn. Rather unconvincingly, the story was that suddenly the economy is doing much better, and they'd looked down the back of a couch and suddenly there was more money for pensioners after all. The backlash, in fact, was so furious it led to a sharp rise in pensioners claiming pension credit, ironically helping to reduce pensioner poverty, costing the government an extra £200 million. So an event aimed to balance a budget will probably end up saving next to nothing. But the important thing is that although this is a massive political story, in terms of government finances, poverty and the economy, it's more of a sideshow. Pension spending is set to soar in the next few decades. Pension and benefits will reach £180 billion by 2029 to 30. As more people retire and birth rates fall, we are basically an ageing society. But as we age, the political voting bloc of pensioners gets stronger. Today's 32% of the effective electorate is over 65. These days, with first past the post, you can win a 100-seat majority with less than 34% of the vote. You don't have to be an election guru to work out the politics of that, especially when the legacy print media are vigorous cheerleaders for their mostly older readership. In 2025 to 26, the government is expected to spend £1.3 trillion. But where does it all go, and why does it feel like there's not much money left over for important things? Well, the biggest component is benefits, pensions and welfare, £430 billion. Next comes healthcare at £277 billion. In fact, at the recent spending review, health was the biggest recipient of extra spending, meaning there was relatively little left over for anything else. The whole experience of winter fuel shows that once benefits are in place, it's very difficult to take anything away. But the problem is, with a stagnating economy, and the UK economy has stagnated pretty much since 2009, you can't increase spending on pensions without taking it from elsewhere. Since 1997, the state pension, admittedly from a very low level, increased by 50% in real terms. Child benefit fell in real terms. Birth rates falling through the floor, falling much faster than OS predicted. Spending per student on schools has fallen since 2010 too. There's a clear issue here that spending on older people getting more money, spending on child benefit and education not doing so well. But actually, if we look at changes to spending since 2007, the biggest growth areas are not pensions, but actually debt interest and healthcare spending. Healthcare as a share of GDP has risen from 3% in 1960 to 9% today, but this will continue to rise over the coming years. Today, the government gave its long-awaited spending review, and there's a blizzard of big numbers which can be hard to decipher. The big picture really is that there isn't much fundamental change in most departments who've been squeezed over the past 15 years, most of the increase going to healthcare. But one concern of higher spending on healthcare is that despite large increases, it hasn't always translated into better health. Since 2019, more money, more staff has increased more than actually emergency treatment and admissions. Waiting lists have actually risen in the past decade. Whilst COVID was a very real challenge, extra money is no magic solution. Now, on the positive side of a spending review, there was $39 billion to help build social housing, a welcome rise on the previous government's allocation of $11 billion. Dig deeper, and it's £39 billion of loans over 10 years, also accompanied with a rise in social rents. Also, there's an extra £14 billion to invest in building a new nuclear power station, and this investment will be funded by borrowing. But whilst these big sums can seem very impressive, it is worth asking the question, Why has it become so expensive to build in the UK? Are these £39 billion of loans the best way to increase the housing stock or reduce housing poverty? The high cost of building HS2, high cost of building housing and nuclear power or new transport networks all mean that return on investment is often much less than other similar countries. Now, there was a time when higher healthcare spending could be funded by decreasing defence spending, but now there's pressure to increase defence spending even more than the decline in overseas aid. In fact, defence was the second biggest growth area of government spending. But the biggest growth area in the future is something else. It's welfare spending. The OBR predict that the Health and Disability Benefit Bill will rise from 66 billion to 98 billion by the end of the decade. A rise, by the way, which is not mirrored in other similar European countries. And of course, this has a double whammy. With a rise in long-term sickness has led to a fall in participation rates, lower employment. When people sign on sick, it's not just benefits go up, but the government's tax revenue which goes down. Now, the pension triple lock guarantee means that pensions will keep rising as a share of GDP. By 2050, the share of state spending on people over retirement age will increase from 15% to 21%. And all this increase in spending on health, pensions, welfare is causing borrowing to rise because for the past 20 years, governments have sought to meet their fiscal rules by kind of front-loading spending rises and promising to reduce spending later in the parliament. But it doesn't really happen. A good example is a promised rise in petrol duty, which is added in to improve a budget, but then chancellors never implement it. It's been frozen since 2011. So the higher spending commitments announced today really will leave very little room for the chancellor's own fiscal rules. And it's almost certain that higher taxes will be needed in November if she's going to meet self-imposed rules. Taxes as a share of GDP has been rising for a decade. And the truth is, there'll be tremendous pressure for taxes to keep going up. Perhaps this is one reason why consumer saving has increased so much in recent years. It means consumers have been cutting back on spending, worried about higher taxes in the future or just the economic shocks we've been having. And so when consumer spending and growth is weak, we tend to see lower investment, lower productivity growth, lower tax revenue, creating this unwelcome cycle of low economic growth. The problem is that all this extra spending on health, welfare and pensions is causing government debt to steadily go up. Ever since 2022, UK bond yields have risen substantially. The UK has maintained a premium over German bond yields, meaning it's much more expensive for the UK to borrow, meaning that the Chancellor doesn't have a confidence to increase borrowing even more than what she is doing at the moment. The result of all this borrowing and higher bond yields is that debt interest payments have gone up almost double in just a few years, over £100 billion a year. And with debt interest payments set to take a higher share of national income, there's of course less room for spending in other areas of the government's departments. The fundamental problem is that since 2009, the UK economy virtually stopped growing. Real GDP per capita has slowed down to a trickle. Therefore, with an ageing population, the economy just isn't growing fast enough to fund the more real-term spending that we've got used to in the post-war period. And this is what's behind a growing sense of frustration, a sense that things just aren't working, be it potholes in the roads, waiting lists of doctors, or lack of affordable housing. And so effectively for many working-age people with stagnant real wages, living standards have been really squeezed, and the prediction is that the squeeze will keep going in the next few years. A lot of this is driven by higher housing costs. This is behind a lot of the rise in UK income inequality in recent years. By the way, going back to winter fuel, Paul Johnson of the IFS said if he wanted to reduce poverty, a U-turn on winter fuel would not be even in the top 100 list of things to do, because a real driver of poverty is rising housing costs and a squeeze in benefits such as child benefit, two-child cap, housing benefits, job seekers allowance linked to just inflation. For many adults who are paying rent, there's very little left over at the end of the month. In the 2010s, the Bank of England were creating money under quantitative easing, and this helped to reduce bond yields, make it cheaper to borrow. But the money didn't really flow into the real economy. It didn't cause higher economic growth, but it did, to some extent, coincide with rising asset prices. But rising wealth doesn't improve living standards. Homeowners may see paper increases in wealth, but unless you sell them and rent, it doesn't mean very much to you. But rising house prices does make it harder to buy. And if you can't buy, like many people can't, then rents have been rising faster than inflation. The UK has certainly done a lot better at increasing wealth relative to income. But the poorest 50% of the population own just 9% of the nation's wealth. So that is a rough idea why, although government is spending a lot of money, we don't seem to be getting a better return for it. A lot of extra spending on health, pensions and debt interest payments. And it is a problem that the UK population is ageing, and also quite interesting that the birth rate's falling much faster than the UK government predicted. And if anything, the birth rates could fall even more. Should we be worried about that? Why is it happening? And is there anything the government could do to change it? Certainly not this recent budget will do much to help that. But anyway, this video goes into more detail about that question, and it is quite interesting, so check it out. Thanks a lot.